So our speaker today, Johanna Taylor, is from Arizona State University, and she's an assistant professor at the Herberger Institute for Design and the Arts. And I'm really excited for Johanna's talk today. I was telling her that selfishly, this is an area that I am always looking for more scholarship and people interested in. So I love hearing new work. And she will be talking today about the future of artists in government, a research overview. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Johanna, and I will be on the lookout for comments and questions that come up.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the Center for Cultural Affairs team for this invitation. I am really excited to be here, and I, like Joanna, look forward to the conversation at the end. So I'm curious to hear what other people are doing in this space or interested in. My goal for this presentation is to present the broader framing of this research agenda about artists embedded in government, rather than going in depth into one specific project. I have a number of different things underway that I will present to you and show you what I've been doing in terms of scholarly outputs, as well as more of a public scholarship approach to this work, as well as my next steps and opportunities for future research. I see that this space of artists embedded in government is part of a larger new push within the cultural policy research agenda around the expanded field of what can be happening in this space and where cultural policy practitioners themselves are going, that artists in residence and government programs are one policy tool within a larger suite, such as UBI for artists, like what's happening in New York and Puerto Rico, or artist employment programs such as California Creative Corps. So just a thought to everyone, if a potential point of conversation for later could be about this kind of being like a call to action for how us as cultural policy researchers can be pursuing research that connects the practice and how it informs what the future of this space is about. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts both about the research as well as about this broader topic. So in this presentation, I will be detailing the broader methods and research questions of the work that I have been doing, introducing the overarching framing of the field, discussing some current findings and models that have arisen out of this work, as well as presenting next steps and the work that I'm doing with a collaborative group called Care Lab, of which I'm one of 3 people, along with Amanda Lovely and Mallory Roxana Nizam. So we're using this kind of research to underscore what's happening and connect with practitioners nationally. So first, the research questions for this space. I have been asking, what are the challenges and opportunities of artists and government working together? How do artists operate within the context of those challenges and opportunities to address civic goals? And what program structures are being implemented and what actors are involved. So far, I have been focusing a lot on kind of how things are working and what are the different structures of artists and government coming together look like. But all of this is also informed by a broader interest in thinking about what is possible in this space. So as civic agencies and people across the country are increasingly turning to collaborations with artists to address deeper systemic challenges, whether that means internal racial inequities in terms of how the government operates, to thinking about affordable access to housing. What is the future potential of this field to incrementally advance systems change, or is there a potential? This is my deeper ongoing question, to which I have not come to an answer yet. It's also a question that I have found that many practitioners in the space share, and that it's something that they're asking back to me. So I find that this is something that's continuing to drive my inquiry into this field. So in doing this work, I have been working on this topic since 2020. I've been conducting interviews with people who are around affiliated with this work. So artists, government staff, other partners, whether they are funders or part of partnering nonprofit organizations or advocacy groups, using some surveys as a tool to fill in some gaps, reviewing materials about their programs and about their collaborations with artists. And the data has also been coming increasingly from my own positionality. I see myself as a kind of embedded scholar practitioner in this space, and strive to be consistently in dialogue with people that are in collaboration with civic spaces if they're artists or artists that are working in this space, and to be, whether that means as a consultant or serving on different advisory boards. So I see this as kind of this ongoing active dialogue as the research continues. So to begin with, this field of artist embedded in government is not entirely new. Artists have been active in cross-sector collaboration for as long as artists have been working in the world. Some recent examples from over the past half century include artists and physicists working together at CERN to create different nuclear development research, the Artists Experiment in Art and Technology Group, which was launched in New York and partnered with Bell Labs, and resulted in projects that were both furthering the work of the company as well as exhibited in traditional arts spaces, as well as the Palo Alto Research Center, which operated in the 90s at Xerox, so connecting artists and scientists to launch new business opportunities for the company. Also, within the artist and government context, as we all know, artists and government have been connecting in lots of different ways for a long time. So this is a highly abridged history that's part of a larger sort of more art historical approach that I've been taking to this work. The Park Service has been hosting residencies with artists since 1916. The WPA hosted 5,000 artists at its peak to do paid work on civic projects around the country. The NEA was established initially to embody a hope, as it was said, and gave fellowships to both visual artists and writers until that became entangled in the culture wars, but was established to support artists as individuals. And then since 1977, Meryl Latterman-Ukeles has been an unpaid artist in residence in the New York City Department of Sanitation. So a project that she had started and had launched and is continuing today. And that work definitely continues over the course of this century so far. In 2002, NASA appointed Laurie Anderson as an artist in residence. Public Art St. Paul launched a program in 2005 that continues to today. Two projects happened in 2012, which have become kind of cornerstones of this field. Rostin Wu's Project Willowbrook in Los Angeles County, and Francis Whitehead, who worked on the 606 Green Space Public-Private Partnership in Chicago. And then around this time, formal artist in residence and government programs started to launch in 2015 with programs in Boston and New York, which continue, and then continuing to expand in 2020 with the first statewide residency program. So artists and government collaborating, it's not new, it's been going on. It's increasingly seen as an opportunity for people to consider and pursue in addressing their broader civic policy goals. So Meryl Latterman-Ukeles, who I mentioned, is often seen as the foundational figurehead in this space. The New York City Public Artist in Residence program mentions her name directly as inspiring their work. She started her project in 1977 at the department and launched with a way that she made the foundations of the department, the people, the sanitation trucks, the systems of maintaining the city through care and maintenance as the artwork itself. So one project that she has done was called Touch Sanitation, in which she went around and recognized the generally unseen labor of every sanitation worker by shaking their hands. So shifting how the policy or how the department typically operated in order to value the work that the sanitation department was doing in their day-to-day practice. This is also evident in her project, The Social Mirror, where as the garbage truck drives down the street and you're standing on the sidewalk, you see yourself as being implicated and a part of this system of care of the city. The sanitation department is crucial in maintaining the city for everyone that lives there. So Meryl's work really was setting the foundation for what was possible in terms of connecting with an artist, starting to think about things differently, and has continued to inspire other civic agencies to consider collaborating with an artist to create something new. So all of this work draws on three different bodies of academic literature. The first is about artist residencies. I chose to pursue this language and framework because this idea of a residency is a standardized model within primarily the visual arts world, but also within other disciplinary spaces. It is seen to provide space, time, resources, connections, other ways to support artists as they further their careers. Plus, the US government, as I already mentioned, has hosted artists in residence and parks and NASA. So it's a normal practice. Formal artist in residence and government programs use different language. Not everyone calls it a residency, but the same sort of model applies. So I choose to use that language within this work. The other literature is about arts and non-art spaces. As mentioned, artists have been working in science labs and business and technology. This is an understood form of practice already, and it is seen to shift institutional goals and create new opportunities, sparking new business ideas. It's discussed as being mutual learning for both the people who are in the science lab or business space, as well as for the artist. And it can benefit both what's happening internally within a specific agency, as well as externally, meaning how a company or agency is communicating with its community or audience. The big thing really is that it is this promoting innovation, inspiring new ways of thinking, really about making risk-taking desirable, promoting belonging, social connectedness, really shifting the foundations through which an organization operates to create new opportunities. All things that we are familiar with in terms of what is possible in the creative practice, right? So taking those ways of working and embedding it in a different space. Also within this space, Frances Whitehead, the artist from the 606 Project in Chicago, talks about artists being double agents in civic work, meaning they bring their work as artists in terms of what's happening outside of a civic space or business space or whatever to that work, and they're able to navigate between those different ways of working, and that's a crucial foundation to creating this type of change that you see here. The other body of literature that I draw on is about cross-sector collaboration and government. This has been really foundational in terms of people thinking for decades around how do you connect governments to think differently? Like, how do you create the foundations for a productive collaboration or program that can shift some of the entrenched ways of working that governments are prone to fall into just by virtue of lack of staff capacity or time. So this literature shows that it creates opportunities to create new ideas to respond to complex problems, but it can also be challenging and risky if there aren't clear expectations detailed from the onset. So who's running specific programs? What does work look like? How do we make it possible to move things forward? So really the core lesson from this literature is that it requires the government to work differently. So the government has to want to work differently. And in order to do that, there are clear work structures and roles of everyone involved that need to be detailed from the onset. So within this space, as I mentioned, my focus is on these formal programs, but I am also interested in what's happening more broadly, right? So artists don't necessarily just come into government work as through these formal programs. There's only so many across the country, and artists are people just like everyone else, right? There's lots of ways to work in government. So across the spectrum, I have a range based on who is determining the scope of work that's being done. So does the government have more control over what that looks like, or is it the artist that is kind of determining what the scope of work and collaboration can be? So at the government end of the spectrum, there are naturally occurring artists in residence, which is a term coined by Elizabeth Hamby, who herself has been working within the city, New York City, for a while. And she refers to that as someone like her, right? Like, she's a government worker who is also an artist. So her own creative practice informs her work. She brings it to work every day, even though it's not technically in the job description that she had applied for. Also in this space, governments, just like any other company, are bringing in artists in specific contractor positions. whether that means for something that is more understood as like running a story circle or something that is seen as an arts practice, or to develop a report. So someone that comes in to complete a task determined by the government. In this middle section, I place the formal artist in residence in government programs. So someone that has participated in one program, or in cities such as Los Angeles and Seattle, there's artists who are doing this work pretty consistently. Someone who ends up collaborating in lots of different ways with government. So I call them serial artists in government. And then on the other end of the spectrum is someone who doesn't work within the government or doesn't come in at the invitation of the government. So they're not an invited collaborator. They are initiating the collaborations themselves. So they have the idea, they bring together a community organization and the government in order to get that done. So there's lots of different ways in which artists are embedded in government and lots of different ways in which these roles are working. And within my broader research, I'm talking to people across all of these different categories. But as I mentioned, my emphasis has been on these formal programs because I see them as a way to, it's because they have some structure, it's easier to make more discrete comparisons towards working towards my broader research question about, is there a systems change potential here? They are expanding across the country. Program directors are talking to one another. So there's the ability to gather data towards understanding what sort of broader change is possible. So most of these programs last about 1 year, and they connect artists and government staff, often also community, to collaboratively address a specific civic issue. And they are intentional in choosing to use art methods to create that change. Often it's one artist, particularly in a new program. Sometimes they work in cohorts, particularly in larger cities, and we'll look at an example in a minute. Artists are working across agencies. Basically, you name it, it's happening somewhere. Often in a mayor's office, often in parks, often in sanitation, inspired by ukuleles, but also in human rights, public health, immigrant services, all sorts of other places, in specific programs like Vision Zero. And it's happening at all levels of government, cities, states, and there's continually discussion of a federal program, but we will see if that happens. So this takes a couple of different structures, and I have some models of this, two of which I'll share with you here, which are inspired by a model created by Lehman about artist residencies more generally. So the model shows the connection between the artist, the context in which they're working, and the government and the structure that the government is operating in. Every single program, which can create some challenges, especially when it comes to trying to understand the impacts that are possible. Every program is unique and it responds to the local context. So they are interested in that it has to respond to the local social, political, environmental, economic context of that place in order to create something that can be impactful. So within this single artist model, which is one example here, using the Chattanooga City Artist Program as an example, they brought in one artist who had a Chattanooga background and was just returning to the city. The residency was initially 10 months, although extended, which is also a common finding. Many are extended. It was for a part-time program, and the artist received mentor support from an artist in New York City that she worked to find. The program was led by the government art department in collaboration with the mayor's office, which was vital to help provide access for the artist to reach higher ups in other spaces. She ended up working with the Department of Transportation through those connections, and they provided materials and space to the artist. It was the first program. She hit some complications through COVID and staffing changes, and it, in this case in particular, they were benefited from the artist being dedicated to the project and making things happen amid those changes. The other common model is this artist cohort model, which is typical in larger cities. So the program in Boston has been around since 2016, and it launched because of support from a new mayor, and was it the goal for the program was embedded within the larger cultural equity plan that was launched at the same time. And it has continued to grow and is ongoing since this time. They released a report last year, which is also a super useful resource to understand how this works. So they bring in a cohort of artists across disciplines for a 12-month residency. They're all locally based. And just like in Chattanooga, there's a set number of hours and a set total rate that the artist receives. I find that often artists end up working more than they're paid for, which presents a different set of challenges. It's led by the art department or the civic art office, and it connects each artist to different agencies around the city. This program is particularly interesting because they have been happening for a number of years. So they're able to refine program operations every year and create new ways to improve communication across artists and with the departments they're working with, which is one of the largest challenges that arise within this space around how do you facilitate communication across agencies and ensure that everyone is on board to get the work to happen as it moves forward. They have also been able to focus on different agendas. So they've refocused the program to be about addressing racial equity as their goal and are continuing to strive for that incrementally as the work moves forward. So out of this, I'm not going to get into it now, but I've developed sort of a framework for how programs are developed and what they look like. But as I mentioned already, the number one thing is that they're responsive to local contexts. And so there's a paper that I published last year that gets into the questions for cities or other agencies to ask to ensure that they're considering all of these different sets of challenges when programs are being put together. So out of these different program structures and ways of working with artists, there are a few larger policy recommendations and tensions and opportunities that I want to highlight that can inform potential future work in this space. The first is a balance of power and access. If a city is bringing in one particular artist into the space, obviously artists are coming in with a different level of power and access in the city itself. So cross-sector collaboration literature says that the work can advance more when bringing people together than any individual can achieve alone. Yet in any sort of institutional practice, there are leadership hierarchies that remain. So government staff are participating as a part of their jobs, but often artists are only given a set number of hours in order to get the work done. And often community members don't receive any type of compensation. And all of this is exacerbated by the ongoing precarity of artists, which we are all aware of. So often government staff recognize that the artists are only involved for a short period of time. So if they don't recognize the value in the work, it discourages them from collaborating. Like, why should they participate with someone who's only around for the next 6 months when, they're there for the next 5 years until they retire or whatever that looks like. So it's very important to create the foundations through which some sort of change is possible. One of the ways to do that in what I've seen is to bring in an outside organization. Sometimes this is an arts nonprofit, sometimes it's some other community organization, like in the case of the residency that happened at the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. It was launched because of fair and just prosecution coming in and connecting some of these dots and being able to balance out the power hierarchies that could have existed otherwise. So having this outside nonprofit collaborator is beneficial. Another strategy is to have someone in this translator role, even if it's not an outside person, maybe it's someone who's inside who can connect understandings about artists with the other people involved. And then also to have regular check-in meetings for people to discuss. Another thing to acknowledge through this balance of power and access is, according to Amanda Lovely, who served as St. Paul City artist for a number of years and has been embedded in government spaces for a long time. She and other people see the artist as a unicorn. They're the only one of their kind within government. So it's important to create facilitate communication to bring people together. This is totally possible though. Alan Nakagawa, who's done a lot of this work in LA, refers to this as a sagrada familia, when everything works together and the balance is achieved. Another tension is intellectual property. Artists are in this role temporarily and need the work to carry with them into the future, which isn't necessarily something that cities understand when they're typically used to working with contractors who are coming in to fulfill a report or something that the city then owns the intellectual property for, where an artist needs to exhibit the work in some way to further their future career. So this is increasingly happening. The work that you see here was completed by an artist in residence in New York City, and it was purchased by a number of different museums. Alan Nakagawa, who I mentioned, has published a book about his work. Another New York City artist, Amanda Pingbodibakia, created a commission for the city that was in Time magazine and is currently on view as a part of the Bangkok Biennial. So this work is happening. And some of the strategies to get there that programs are starting to develop are to have clear letters of agreement that detail intellectual property rights, not just during the residency, but also beyond that term, and to have transparent discussions about what that looks like to support everyone involved. So out of all of this, as I mentioned, I'm interested, and it's also come up in conversation with a lot of the civic staff that I've talked to. We are all wondering, like, so what is the systems change potential of this, right? Like, okay, this is great. Like, this work is starting different conversations, is inspiring new ideas within civic government. Like, some artists are getting recognition in the art world, but can this really address the deeper systems change questions that we want to happen in our cities or in our federal government? People want to see this happen. One of the civic staff that I talked to referred to this as the big evil plan, that like, while this seems like a great project, let's bring in an artist. It's really like the big evil plan is we want something deeper, right? So the things that have come up in looking for the potential for that is that the big evil plan is not going to happen overnight, right? Like any sort of change within a government space, it takes time. And the goal is to start small and keep going and find some way to acknowledge and celebrate the small change wins as that work is happening. So one example of a small change is this land acknowledgement confluence room, which Marcus Young created at the Minnesota State Department of Transportation, is a space to bring together transportation workers to acknowledge that they work on Indigenous land and that they are supporting connecting people across Indigenous lands, past, present, and future. Is it changing everything about transportation in the state? No. The goal is it's starting small, it's bringing people together, it's encouraging them to do their daily work in a small, different way. So, as I mentioned, I'm actively dedicated to connecting the work that I'm doing and the conversations I'm having with people that are doing this work in government spaces as artists, as community members nationally. And one of the ways in which I'm doing this is with my collaborators, Amanda Lovely and Mallory Roxana Nizam. Together, we have formed this group we call Care Lab. And our tagline is, "We turn your civic dreams into action through creativity for a just future." So we use the research I'm doing. They are engaged in research as well. They both have experience in this space as artists, designers, facilitators, and practitioners. And together we are trying to support people, shift conversations, and support the work to move forward in this change-based space. So we see ourselves as in this liaison space, as you can see in this Missed Connections post we put on Instagram last winter that was a part of a Valentine's piece we wrote for the American Planning Association. So we're trying to link people, we're trying to connect the dots. So this work is taking lots of different forms. So we're doing some consulting, both recently with Ottawa and Minnesota, California. We've put out different training programs and support. We're currently working on this program design suite of games, which is kind of fun. So like turning this like research and lesson into something that's like the tangible and interesting rather than dry in an academic paper, even though I love academic papers. We also recently got an NEA design grant, and we're working with Smart Growth America to launch this Transportation Artist in Residence Network. Again, it's about bringing people together around the country to talk about what works for you, what doesn't, how can we help you get started, what does this look like? And I'm also working to develop an open source database around these programs nationally, because the biggest lesson that comes up both in the research and through the work with Care Lab is that not just the artists feel like unicorns, but the people that are doing these programs nationally also feel like unicorns. Like they're isolated in their town or state, and they don't necessarily talk to others. So I'm interested in starting this opportunity for them to come together and to aggregate information so that it is accessible and possible. And this is something that I'm starting to develop, and I'd love your thoughts or ideas on if you've done something similar or have ideas about what this could look like. So if you're interested in this work too, follow Care Lab. We have these games and an update kind of resources email coming soon. So yes, as I mentioned at the beginning, I really see this cultural policy landscape as shifting, and that this is one suite of programs within these larger changes. And I'm excited to see what happens next. And hopefully, as the work continues, we'll have some clearer answers around the systems change potential of this work. So thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Johanna. This is so interesting to hear about your research, but also all of the kind of entrepreneurial extensions that you've made to your research work. You seem busy. So I'm going to just start with some of the chats in the chat box, and then everybody else on the call. We have a great group with us. I see just all the names, and I'm so thrilled to see everybody here. Please just feel free to raise your hand or put something in the chat. But Mel had a couple of questions in the chat, which I'll just sort of read out. So he talks about the economics perspective, that art and artists are the specialized labor input in a production function, and that they presumably have some identifiable impact on output. So the art as a means to an end rather than art as an end, collective or merit goods. So he asks this question, which I think is really relevant here. Is it artist per se that is important, or is it presumed creativity that is the input into these urban processes? And then he also follows up on that with, what is the value of the marginal product of an embedded unicorn? Which I love that question too. So maybe if you could try to address one or two of those questions, see what you have to say.
Thank you. I love that question because I typically don't think about it from the economics perspective. So I think it's useful. I think towards the first part of the question, I agree with where you're headed with that. It's not necessarily artists per se. It really is this creative practice, this like, let's mix up how things have worked typically. So maybe it's an artist, maybe it's a designer, maybe it's just someone who's come in from a different sector. I mean, I think the evidence from the cross-sectoral collaboration literature really is like anyone that's coming in that's mixing up the typical way of working has the capacity to shift how the government functions. So I think for these programs specifically, the interest is on artists and understanding the conditions in which artists need to support their work and move things forward to facilitate those cross-sectoral changes. But it's not artists alone that can make some sort of change within government. Mm-hmm. And the second part of the question, can you remind me?
What is the value of the marginal product of an embedded unicorn?
I think that's the point where, like, I think we're still trying to understand what that looks like. And I feel like in this, I'm trying to move beyond I think it's really easy in this space, or like, this is sort of creative placemaking adjacent, right? It's really easy to rely on short one-off case studies to say, isn't this great? We all made whatever together and everyone was really happy about it. And so I feel like where I am right now is trying to say, okay, how can I translate this into something that is measurable to be able to actually talk about what that value is, rather than just saying like, oh, this transportation official saw how much happier their staff was the next day, or something like that. Like, I think we're still struggling with that. So I would love ideas.
Right. And then Monica had a question as well. So based on her experience, she talks about the there's resistance and prejudice from both sides. So both from the government and the artist side, and for lots of reasons, but maybe to see what your opinion on that, or maybe something you've observed in your work.
I think the number one thing is not everyone has to do this. Just because you're an artist does not mean you have to work in government. Just because you're a government employee doesn't mean you should be working with artists. I think it really has to be something that is mutually beneficial. I think that the number one reason why people come to this from either side is because they have some sort of shared desire, shared goal. Like the Minnesota program that CareLab was just supporting is launching a residency in rural Minnesota around source water protection. And so like that's what's bringing people together, is like artists in rural Minnesota and civic governments in rural Minnesota that are concerned about water, right? So they come together with a shared goal, and that helps to kind of alleviate some of the tensions, because the tensions are inevitable. Meaning, if you don't want to do the work, you don't have to be there. It's not for everybody. Because that, as you indicate, I think it comes up a lot.
Diane also has actually, Michael, I just had a quick question about where he can read more about the Artists Embedded at Xerox project.
Yeah, Celie Brown, who ran the program, has a book about it that I can look up and put in the chat. It's super fascinating. I'd say that's the place to. John Celie Brown has I can't remember what the book is called, but that would be the place to start. There's also another book called Artists in Labs that talks about some of this work as well at Xerox and in other places.
Right. I recently came upon a book called Artists in Offices too, which I was in the stacks in the library. Who goes there anymore? But I was there and I saw it. And so this might be relevant to that. So Diane has a great question too. And this is about the sort of role of supporting artists or artist welfare, or that being a function of some of these programs. So is it consistent or clear across projects whether the justification of working with artists on these projects contains arguments related to a way of supporting artists, or artists providing new ways of being, doing, knowing that can support challenges facing cities, or perhaps a combination of both?
I feel like the emphasis is not on new ways of supporting artists. It's really on this desire to achieve civic goals, which I think goes back to that, like, this work is not for everybody. Like, if it typically ends up being people that see themselves more in this social practice-y type of space, or more performance-based, that like organizing talks that are drawn to it. I think there probably should be more emphasis on what can this mean for artists, which is why I've been pushing some of the intellectual property conversations and addressing artist precarity. And I think like I don't think I mentioned it, but like one of the big things that civic agencies can do for artists is give them space and a government email address. Like their own individual email might not get them through the door somewhere, but if you have a government email address, you can use that as leverage to facilitate other things. So it's like acknowledging the levels of power that the government can bring to support the artist in their career. But we're not quite there yet in terms of how programs are operating.
Right. So Sunil also has a great comment. Everybody can take a look at it in the chat, but it's just about the role of artists in government and perhaps the BEA measures that come from the share of the total arts and cultural economy. But I saw Michael's hand up as well, so I'll call on Michael now.
Okay, thanks. And thanks, Johanna, for a really interesting talk. I'm going to just allow me to play the role of devil's advocate here just for a moment. Suppose I'm a policy analyst in some division of government. I might be someone who sees artists in government as helpful in terms of messaging, different kinds of things we want to communicate to the public. So sort of a more sophisticated and aesthetic branch of marketing and public relations, where artists can have more creative ideas about that. But when it comes to actual policy, is there not a worry that artists come in somewhat as dilettantes, unschooled in sort of the deep structural issues that are required? So if we talk about, say, protection of source water, to give an example you did, that's a really difficult problem. And we have lots of people in our school who study these questions for years and years and years, how to manage water policy. And an artist comes in and we say, okay, you can maybe help with, messaging people that protecting source water is important. But in terms of real policy, in terms of how are we going to manage our water resources to their best use, take care of conservation problems, is an artist actually going to bring anything? And is there a false sense that artists actually have some special wisdom or insights to bring to this that they really don't have? So as I say, I just raise this as an objection I might expect from some people working in the public service, but I'd be interested in your answer.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, I agree that that is a kind of common question and an important piece to address, and something that, especially from my care lab work, we see people that are working in civic arts departments are concerned about addressing, and they get that question more directly than I do. So I think the main thing there is that I agree with you that the kind of the communication, the community aspect of this work is the easy entry point for governments more generally. It's what is more commonly understood, right? Like everyone understands, like, oh, city art, we're going to put a mural on the wall, we're all going to paint it together, everyone's going to be happy kind of conversation. Or to change communication between the civic entity and their constituents, where normally they're so strapped and people don't necessarily know what's going on, right? Like, I think that's the space that is the easy entry point where things can be starting. I think the answer to the other question is more broadly that artists are not going to be experts in source water. They're not going to be experts in policy making. I think that it also has to do with a question around who should be involved in policymaking and who should policymakers be talking to and who should be at those tables. Even if someone isn't an expert in source water, we are all dependent on water in order to live. And so if having other people in that space besides people that are deeply entrenched in the politics of it and understanding all of the complications and understand all the reasons why everything is impossible and it's all difficult and we should just say no to these specific things, that it shifts how those conversations can happen in order to hopefully spark some new ideas. And again, I think back to the other question, it's like, is it an artist, or is it, maybe the source water team needs someone from the transportation department to understand how they addressed a similar question of navigating all these different complexities that then the source water people can apply to how they address their own policy. So it's not undermining the expertise of the water team.
So to piggyback on that, Doug had a question in the chat, and so if we think broadly and accept that it's not just artists that can change things up, then why are artists the best option? And might we want to also see similar engagement with other professions, therapists, pastors, chemists, et cetera? But I would also argue, we have, for example, in certain government processes, a layperson is involved for this very reason. Mm-hmm. So what is it that the artist brings specifically? And can we just consider this to be a different type of person that is making decisions?
Well, I think from the cross-sector collaboration, public administration literature, they'd say this has been happening for a long time, right? Like, just as you mentioned, like we have had lay people involved in lots of things for a reason, right? Like we want lots of different perspectives. It doesn't have to just be artists. I think to some extent it's artists now because, as I mentioned, I see this as like one new toolkit within the broader cultural policy toolkit that civic leaders are leveraging in terms of how do they support artists. Also from just a practical perspective, it's like often artists aren't necessarily employed in one full-time job. We know them as gig workers that are compiling a different suite of things together. And so maybe that makes their ability to come into this work more accessible. But I agree, like, why not have more people involved in government? We are all dependent on governments to support our lives. I want lots of perspectives to get there. But I think it's because of the combination of who's involved in inspiring these programs to happen.
Mm-hmm. And I think Michael Feldman's chat is also relevant to this. So he talks specifically that, a central element of his arts practice around climate change and similar issues is about changing perspective. It's about how time shifting equips stakeholders at all levels to decide to make sacrifices and seize opportunities around a problem whose worst impacts they might not experience for years. And if not, and so he's asking, is that an impact that you see in this artist government collaboration? I mean, I think you just spoke to it a little bit, is this sort of change in perspective.
Definitely. I think that that's true. And I see Michael sent me a direct message as well.
Okay.
I think that it's like part of this broader kind of art historical aesthetic piece that I'm starting to map out and to see how these changes are happening over time. So I'm starting to think more that way. So a good observation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Carol Rosenstein has her hand up.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Johanna, for a really interesting presentation of this work going on. I wonder if you have considered laying out some of this information in a way that distinguishes more clearly between the public administration dimensions of the work, of what you're finding, the broad public policy dimensions, the specifically cultural policy dimensions, and the issues around community engagement. Because I feel as though some of the questions that are being raised might be addressed effective. I mean, I think all of that information is sort of there in your work, but in some ways using just this broad term of like policy and what it has to do with artists and government is kind of confusing some of those issues. So I wonder if that's something that's coming up in the way you'll present your work more broadly, or if that's something you all have tangled with.
Thank you, Carol. I think that's a really good observation. I think that you've almost laid it out more clearly than kind of where I've been thinking. I think that's why I'm trying to tease out this like more art specific component, but I think that your suggestion of more clearly delineating the others would help it too. And I'll consider what that could look like to make it more concrete. So thank you. I think that's useful.
Tal had a question too, which Sunil sort of partially answered, but I was curious from your perspective, Johanna, are there also artists doing this kind of work in governmental security agencies, such as the military or police? And you mentioned this starting an open source database, so I figured you might know.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely like artists. I see Sunil's response about artists drawing caricatures, which is true. I also know that different military groups, although I don't know about in the US, have brought in artists. It's sort of like projecting what is the best response using sort of like creative game theory approaches. So like bringing in playwrights to think through these things. So yes, I think it's happening in lots of other ways.
Yeah. Sunil also had a nice question here about maybe considering different training pathways for artists, depending on sort of artist residency requirements by sector, by skill set. Is that something that you've seen in your research at least, or maybe?
That type of stuff is starting to happen. I know within academic spaces, like there's more talk around these sort of alternative collaborations, sort of like within social practice MFA programs, or even somewhat within arts management. I mean, not really, we're like starting to get there. Within more formal training, Springboard for the Arts was working with CPCP and had this art train program, which I think is still happening, around how to connect people and how to do this work. So it's happening kind of in those sorts of spaces. I don't necessarily see formal training programs. And back to that question of, is it only artists, makes me wonder, like, maybe the formal training program needs to be more broad about how to bring lots of people involved in government more, whether or not they're artists. But
yeah, and it speaks to me in a number of chats actually later on in the chat box here are I think thinking along the same lines about this idea of the artist bringing different sorts of methods to the understanding of a policy problem and potential policy solutions. So Adrian, I think, has a good question here that talks about, is not the strength of artist inclusion in non-art spaces more about contributing to mixed method approaches to thinking through a challenge that affects an array of people and communities, and that method is more of a barrier to collective effort than differences between knowledges, perhaps? So that's maybe one way to think about it.
I think that's definitely useful, because that comes up, I mean, in a lot of the arts findings around what are the benefits from connecting with artists and shifting the way governments work. So I think method is a good framing for that. Thank you, Adrienne.
Mm-hmm. And anybody else, feel free to raise their hand. There's a lot of comments. I'm trying to keep everything. And if you want to ask a question that you put in the chat box, you can feel free to unmute yourself as well. I'm trying to keep up. Doug, I see your hand.
Yeah, thanks, Johanna. And I'll just take that moment to sort of plug the stuff that you led here in the AEI lab, that research you did, Johanna, sort of experimenting on having artists in the room with making policy. And one of the big things we found was they promoted more out of the box thinking. And if that's the idea, we need to sort of shake things up and change things, then that can happen. I mean, we didn't test whether or not putting a candlestick maker or any of the other sort of village people in the room, that would have mixed things up too. And so it's an interesting question to me about whether artists, what is their comparative advantage? Are they actually, and people can say, oh, artists are creative, they're out of the box thinkers, and they might not have a lock on that, but it's worth considering. I think the bigger question about I think it came up earlier in the chat about sort of what's the mutual benefit here? What are we doing for artists through this? And then also what are artists expected to contribute here? And not just generically, but rather very specifically, concretely, explicitly, what is it we think that we're trying to accomplish with including the artists? And then is that the best way to do it? You're changing bureaucracies, not a new concept. There's lots of literature and lots of science about that. And to the extent we've been doing a lot of this stuff for a long time, it might not be the best way of engendering systems change on account of we still have the systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. I mean, I think that this work has only gotten more clear more recently around what are the expectations, and that's been a huge challenge to it, which I think you observed in your earlier work as well, right? Like how do you set expectations to be reasonable and aren't necessarily exploitative to an artist who's already in a precarious employment position?
Yeah, I mean, one of the findings of that research also was that those out of the box ideas were not necessarily feasible, right? So the people who worked in public administration and policy looked at the ideas and said, well, we could never actually do that in government. So I wonder then in the programs that you've worked with and your work is like, how do you balance that? I'm going to help the creative process, think of more innovative solutions, but also make sure that these solutions are actually feasible and we can do this within a government system. I mean, how do you balance that within an artist in residence program?
I think the number one thing is we need the work that is focused internally actually has greater benefits than what we realize. Like back to that land acknowledgement confluence room example, it's like do something really small that shifts the landscape internally. Leave the work of doing the work of the Parks Department or the Sanitation Department to the people that are employed to do that work, and change the conditions under which they are working to make them put them in a better position to support the constituents that they want to support, right? Like it's not coming up with grand policy changes that completely changes how a city functions or what its goals are, but it's shifting in a small way the foundations under which they're operating, and that in itself, in a place that is constrained by lots of limiting work functions, is a productive shift.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is honestly, there are analogies to this as well. Like, I mean, I work in a university system where we have faculty and administrators, and many people argue that faculty are not equipped to make administrative decisions. However, faculty are appointed in administrative roles, right? So there's always that fine balance there, which I think these artists in residence programs are also sort of being challenged with. And I love your approach, Johanna, which is taking this from a governmental sort of collaboration literature approach, because we do know a lot from collaborative governance that we can apply here. So I really appreciated that lens that you brought right in the beginning of this presentation. So there's a number of other chats in here. Sorry, I'm trying to keep up, but I'm also very interested in the discussion, so it's hard. So Carol, you had another question here, which was the issues around policies for incorporating artists into government, like how and why. Is it really valuable? This is different from artists bringing their own voice or community voices into policymaking. And so I think like this constant question of like, is there value here? And how do we know that? And where have we seen it?
If I could just say, Johanna, also I followed up by saying one of the things as a matter of cultural policy that is definitely valuable is when artists are embedded in government processes, they can create communications and other kind of messages for the public about what happens in government. That itself is a public value. Apart from being disruptors or agents of change, simply being people who are there, who are message creators, who become part of a public conversation.
Yes, I agree. I think that's really valuable and something that often a strapped government employee doesn't have the time to make happen.
And, Mel then has another idea, which I think leads to, like, can artists facilitate disruptive shifts in service to policy entrepreneurship? So that's, a really well-established kind of line of thinking for entrepreneurial work.